بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So today's class will be a little bit interesting because as we deal entirely with slavery, and I debated, should we skip it? Should I just mention it in passing? And I felt, well, that's not, academically honest. The honest thing to do is to go through the topic. So the topic, as is in the translation, the book that we're using for the translation is Buying a Slave Girl. However, that's not the title in the original text. It's Istibra al-Rahim, which is Istibra in the form of istafala, is to ask that or to make sure that the womb of the slave that you're going to buy is clear. So the reason this follows the section of the iddah is that this is a form of the iddah for in the case of slavery. Now, of course, we don't have any slavery, and you're sick of me saying this, but there is a lot of interesting fiqh and legal theory that will come from the discussion. So we're going to do it in its full expose, and I'll get into all of the details, keeping in mind that obviously the outward form of these rulings, slavery, is no longer valid, but the concept of clearing the womb, which is an act of worship, and we'll come to learn that it's not a genetic DNA situation. We do this out of act of worship to separate, one form of licit sexual activity and another form of licit sexual activity, so that there's a break, so that there is no confusion, there is no issue of lineage, there's no false accusation, so on and so forth. So we're going to do the whole thing, we'll talk about it, and we will be able then therefore to draw parallels to the previous section, which is the iddah, which is the waiting period, which has basically the same function, is to clear the womb, from one relationship to another relationship. So it's one of those things where obviously these books and the texts that we're studying are pre-modern, but we don't throw away. Our tradition is not to throw away or to edit. We continue it even when parts of it are no longer applicable, because we learn the theory behind it. So that's what we're after. So rather than an introduction, this is sort of like a long disclaimer. We'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the way we always begin. Let's turn to the words of our beloved Qadi Abi Shuja radiallahu anhu. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في الاستبراء. ومن استحدث ملك أو ملك أمة حرم عليه الاستمتاع بها حتى يستبرئها، إن كانت من ذوات الحيض فحيضة، وإن كانت من ذوات الشهور بشهر فقط، وإن كانت من ذوات الحمل بالوضع، وإذا مات سيد أم الولد استبرأت نفسها كالأمة. So it looks like it's a little, but inshallah we'll come to see that it is full of discussion points. So he says, rahimahullah, Qadi Abu Shuja radiallahu anhu, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. It is unlawful for someone assuming ownership of a slave girl to have intimate contact with her until making sure that she is not pregnant. Making sure that she is not pregnant, that's what istibra is. If her waiting period is determined by menstruation, then it is a single menstruation. So you see, this is like the iddah. So then you have to wait a menstrual cycle. If her waiting period in a normal situation would be in months, because she doesn't have a menstrual cycle, or she's too young or too old, etc. We talked about that. Then you just wait one lunar month. And if she's pregnant, then her waiting period, or this waiting period, will be the delivery. If the master of a slave who was born his child, this is what called walad, which comes at the end of the book. Walad is that a person owns a slave woman, he has intercourse with her lawfully, she becomes pregnant, so she's walad, she's now the mother of this child, and that will be the structure of how she will be manumitted and free. So if that master, or the owner rather, of a slave who has his born child dies, so the owner now dies, she does the foregoing, meaning she leaves the period of time to ensure that she's not pregnant on her own. It is based on the times for a slave, meaning it's either a menstrual cycle, or it's a month, or it's the delivery. Okay, let us look at the adillah Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The hadith of narrated in Abi Dawood radiallahu anhu on the authority of Abi Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu أنه صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم قال في سبايا أوطاس لا توطأ حامل حتى تضع ولا غير ذات حمل حتى تحيد حيضة. So the Prophet ﷺ in the women that were captured in this battle from the tribe of Awtas. So Sabaya or Sabi is the people that are acquired through warfare. So there is the slave concept in the pre-modern world, which you go to a slave market, you buy or you can buy and sell slaves, you can inherit them, and so on and so forth. But then there's also those that are captured through warfare, which is it's a type of process of ownership. So after that comes into the ownership, the same kind of rules of slavery applies. That's why we usually talk about them in the same place. Of course, all this is in the pre-modern world, I know that. So the Prophet ﷺ, and what's important is that he said, do not have intercourse with one of those women who is pregnant until she gives birth or until she has the child. And do not have intercourse with one of them who is not pregnant but has a menstrual cycle until she has a menstrual cycle. So that's where the rules come from this hadith. And as far as the issue of dying, the last line, this is a form of qiyas based on Malik narrates radiallahu anhu on the authority of Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhuma أنه قال عدة أم الولد إذا توفى عنها سيدها حيضة. So this comes from this hadith of Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhuma, as narrated by Malik, that the idda, the waiting period of the mother of the child, al-Walad, whose owner has died, is that she waits one cycle. Okay, so in the book it's kind of on the slim side, but I remember in the Hashia it's much more robust. So inshallah we will turn to all of that now. Okay, so in the last class we talked about the waiting period, the idda, and we kind of sliced it and diced it, and we got into all of the details about the different types of scenario. Now, one of the philosophies behind that, one of the ideas, the principles behind that, let us say, is that other than it's divinely legislated, so all of this is divinely legislated. So I don't want you to go out thinking from these classes that this is about, this can be substituted for some kind of like DNA testing. He even says, we'll come to that text very soon, that we do this ta'abbudan, we do this out of worship. So this is not about, why do we do it out of worship? What's the proof of that? Because even if the woman is a virgin, she still has to have this waiting period in the slavery context that we're going to talk about. So that proves that it's not about some kind of DNA genetic testing situation. It's not about that. So we do this because we have clear texts that tell us about that. There are wisdoms behind it. There are hikam. And when we talked about usul al-fiqh, we learned that there's a difference between the illah, between the reason behind the law, the ratio legis, and the hikmah, the wisdom. There may be many wisdoms. So why do we shorten our prayers when we travel? You can't say that the reason behind it is al-mashaqqa, is that it's difficulty. Because difficulty is just one of the wisdoms behind that. Because you can travel and it's not difficult. You can have a great time traveling. But if the distance is correct and it's not a haram trip, all that kind of stuff we talked about way back in that section of travel, then you are allowed to shorten your prayers. So there's a difference between the wisdom of something and the reason behind the law. So here, the reason behind this is ta'abbud. We do this out of worship. There's no necessarily rational reason why. But there can be wisdoms, such as separating potential pregnancies and lineages, which based on that will be inheritance, so on and so forth. But that's not the reason behind it, because even a virgin woman would have to go through that. So that's something to keep in mind. And then istibra, as I said in the introductory text, is to ask for. Istafala is to ask for something. So here you are asking for the womb to be cleared from any pregnancy, cleared from the previous relationship, so on and so forth. And that's kind of the basic principle behind the iddah as well, again from the wisdom point of view, not from the ratio legis point of view. From the wisdom point of view, that's one of the wisdoms of it, is um, uh, to clear the womb, and then therefore to clear one relationship from another. We mentioned the hadith in Abu Dawood radiallahu anhu. There's another hadith I want to mention to you, which is from Al-Bayhaqi, that Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, this is in a time after the passing of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, that Ibn Umar said that after a certain battle, a certain slave girl came into his ownership, and she was extremely beautiful, so he kissed her. And the people watched him, the people being the Sahaba. I just wanted to give you this is the Battle of Yarmouk in the 17th year of the Hijrah. This is important because we will come to see that if a man in the slavery situation, a slave is bought or acquired, a man cannot have any type of relationship with her until she does the istibra, including looking at her with desire, touching her, kissing her, etc. It's not just a sexual act. In this case, the Sahaba did not respond or criticize, so he says this is a form of silent ijma' sukuti, because the exception to that is when a woman is acquired through warfare, the prohibition is only intercourse. So that's another point of delete. And I said in the beginning, my disclaimer, we're going to get into the details as we're going to discuss it in all of its details. And, again, the law is a fine thing, so I'm just trying to draw for you the different distinctions. I will come back to this point when we come to the part in the text. Okay. Yeah, well, I'm running out of time, so there's not much more. Let me pick up this discussion in the next clip. I apologize. Okay, we're still kind of defining al-istibra and all of that. So he says, Al-Bajuri says, for example, that the issue of istibra, the real reason behind it is not that a woman has come in possession through slavery or through warfare. Rather, it is to be able to engage in the sexual activity. So, if a man wants to do that, then this is when the istibra situation takes place. And he says that this is something that we do ta'abudan. Okay. The two types of situations that will require the istibra are if a previous licit sexual relationship to the woman has ended. Like he says in the end of this section, al-Walad, the owner passed away. So that we call zawal al-firash, that the bed, firash, because that's usually where intercourse takes place, that has gone away. So she is no longer able to have a licit relationship with that previous man, obviously. So in that case, then she has to do the istibra. And then the second cause is a type of ownership has been acquired. Either a man buys a slave, a man inherits a slave, a man is gifted a slave, etc. So those are the two causes, the two asbab, the sababan, that bring in this discussion of fiqh. Keeping in mind that all of this is no longer applicable, I understand, but we want to understand the logic of the law behind it. Okay, so when he says, rahimahullah, it is unlawful for someone assuming ownership of a slave girl. So this is really only talking about one kind, which is you've assumed ownership, whether it's through, as I said, purchasing, which is kind of like the textbook when you think of slavery, but slavery can also be, slaves can be inherited or can be gifted. They can also be left as a wasiyah. They can also be through inheritance. So inheritance is, it's the portion of the tarika, it's the portion of what's left, but you can also be bequeathed to them or gifted. So in this case, just to repeat, the istibra period is not something that is incumbent by the default acquiring of the slave. It is incumbent if the slave owner, the man slave owner, desires to have sexual intercourse with the slave. That's when this part of the law kicks in. So that's why I said in the beginning, the concept of the istibra, it's not a part of the slavery contract or people that are acquired through the booty of warfare, but rather it is something that is required if there is the desire for the sexual act to take place. And then he says, but in the text, his language is a little bit more precise. It is unlawful for someone assuming ownership of a slave girl to have intimate contact. In the Arabic, it is al-istimta' biha. Intimate contact, in the case of slavery, is any type of intimate contact. So, looking with desire, touching, kissing, feeling, and that's why the hadith of al-Bayhaqi is important, because that shows the difference between a woman who is acquired through warfare than a woman who's acquired through slavery. Just to backtrack a second. Haruma alayhi, it is impermissible for him to engage in sexual activity with her unless and until she does this istibra period, which we'll talk about shortly. However, if he does, which is still haram, it is not considered zina. So this is a farq, this is one of the differences in the fiqh. Why? Because by the act of becoming into his ownership, the default is that therefore the sexual act is legitimate or legal, let's say, licit, but she has to do the istibra period for it to be halal. So it can be haram but not zina. So that's one of, if you're thinking of like fiqh details and principles and differences, this is one of those unique things where the sexual act, so if somebody said, can you come up with a scenario in which the sexual act is haram but not zina? This will be one of them. حتى يستبرئها, until, how does it translate it? It's unlawful to have intimate contact with her until making sure that she is not pregnant. Al-istibra. So making sure that she is not pregnant. This is the outward form of how we comply with this piece of divine legislation. Again, the reason I phrase it that way is I don't want you to think that this is an actual issue of paternity and DNA and all of those kind of things. So now we're going to have the three categories of women who would fall under this situation. So we go back to the section of the iddah, which is why this section comes after the section of the iddah. So we go back to the section of the iddah and we see if a normal woman, free woman's iddah, waiting period, is through menstruation, meaning that she has a menstrual cycle, then you have to wait one menstrual cycle. So if a man buys a slave woman and she is on her period, he has to wait for her to finish that period, have a pure cycle, and then have a period again. However, if a man acquires a slave woman and she is on her pure cycle, she's post cycle, then he has to wait till she has her period. So the timing it's like an accordion, it can be long or short depending on the situation. So if she has a menstrual cycle, you got to wait for the menstrual cycle. And what if she's off her menstrual cycle, but she usually has a menstrual cycle, then you got to wait. So even if it's a month or two until she has her cycle again. So when he says a woman who has her waiting period is determined by the menstrual cycle, as we talked about in the previous section, the last two classes, that's not like a thing that's going to happen immediately for every woman, because sometimes a woman could be off her period, she could be sick, she could, maybe she took medicine or something like that prolonged it. But if in her normal, if you left her alone, she's cycling, and she's menstruating, then you have to wait for that cycle. Usually, not always, but usually women are, if they're in the right age, they usually will have a cycle. But it can be off. There can be delays and this and that for, due to all a sort of host of things. If she does not cycle, meaning that she is menopausal, or in the case of young, she is young, then we're going to wait 1 lunar month. So when she comes into our possession, or not our, because we don't have slaves, but if she comes into the possession of a person in the pre-modern period, then she's going to wait 1 lunar month to clear the womb. Um, So this would be a menopausal woman, a young girl, and al-mutahayyira, or a woman who is completely lost touch with her cycle, and maybe she's not of the menopausal age, but a doctor has determined that she's in that category now where you have to wait a month because there's no foreseeable cycle that's going to come. And then if she is pregnant, it's by the delivery of the child. Now, when it comes to the issue of pregnancy, there's a little bit of fiqh that goes on here. So if a woman is acquired, let's say a woman is bought as a slave, and she's pregnant and she gives birth less than 6 months after the purchase, now we know that 6 months is the minimum amount of the pregnancy in the Shafi'i madhab. So therefore that child is going to be, if she was bought from another slave owner, then that child will be a slave because she'll be part of the previous owner. But if she gives birth after the 6 months, then that's going to be a new pregnancy. So because the minimum pregnancy is 6 months. So if she's acquired and she gives birth less than 6 months, then obviously it's not the new owner's child. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So in a pregnant woman, it's not only the istibra, it's not only the waiting period that's important, it's also determining where the child goes, to which side. Is the child born into slavery or not? Of course, the Sharia in its meta principles structure is يتشوف الشرع إلى العتق. The Sharia, as we were taught and as is documented in our books, is biased towards manumission. So we're going to always do what we can to make sure that the child is born free and not a slave, if that's possible. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so in the last clip we talked about, or in the last clip we talked about the 3 waiting periods, istibrat periods. The first is if a normal woman has her menstrual cycle, then we have to wait for the menstrual cycle. If the woman does not menstruate, then we have to wait a lunar month. And if the woman is pregnant, we have to wait for her to give birth. Okay, if a man, an interesting kind of point of fiqh, if a man buys his wife, a man is married to a woman who's a slave and then is able to purchase her freedom, it's only a sunnah for her to do the istibra, because istibra itself is a form of worship. But in this case, this form of worship is a sunnah. Why? Because he has not reneged on his right to have sexual intercourse with his wife, because she's still his wife. It says that she was a slave and then she was free. So this is one of those points where now you can kind of see the wisdom of us discussing this, is that this shows us how we talk about fiqh. The first thing that we're saying is the concept of istibra is an act of worship. So when we say we do it ta'abbudan, we do it out of worship, it means itself is an act of worship. So that means that we're going to do it pretty much no matter what. It's like, it's an act of worship. Like you come into the mosque and you pray 2 rakahs to greet the mosque. It's an act of worship. So what happens if you come into the mosque after Salat al-Asr? Where in our madhab we are allowed to do that because there's a prior sabab or a concurrent reason, concurrent reason in the prohibited times. But if I was in the mosque after Asr and I just wanted to pray for the sake of praying, in our madhab we wouldn't pray because there's no prayer after Asr prayer. So it's because it's an act of worship. So I want you to think of this as the same thing. So now the scenario before us is a man is married and his wife is a slave. He was able to save enough money, alhamdulillah, and buy and purchase his wife. So The transaction now is that the wife was a slave, was owned, and now is free, which is a great thing. But none of that negates their marriage. So we still have floating around us this concept of an istibra, like praying the 2 rak'ahs. So it's a sunnah. It's a sunnah in that case for her to wait. I don't know why she would wait. Probably they're very happy and they want to express their happiness with one another, but it's a sunnah. He says, وَإِذَا اشْتَرَى زَوْجَتَهُ سُنَّ لَهُ إِسْتِبْرَاؤُهَا. If he buys his wife, then it's a sunnah for her to do the istibra. Now you understand that sentence. I mean, even though it's kind of like a small, like a half a sentence even. Well, it's a full sentence, but you know what I mean. Now you understand the importance of that and kind of the rhyme and reason behind that. Now, if a man buys a slave woman who is married, there is no need to do the istibra because he can't have intercourse with her because she's married. Once that marriage dissolves for whatever reason, then that's when the istibra takes place. And this is something that we said in the beginning of the clips or in this current discussion, that the istibra is not necessarily, it's not an immediate obligation when a man buys a slave woman, or if a man buys a slave woman, but rather if he desires sexual intercourse. And that's how the text, let's just go back to the text for a second. The opening lines, it is unlawful for someone assuming ownership of a slave girl to have intimate contact with her until making sure that she is not pregnant. Well, if he doesn't want to have intimate contact with her, then khalas, there's no need to do that. But when he desires to have the intimate contact, then we're going to have to do the istibra. So that's something to keep in mind, and further emphasizes that this is an act of worship. So, like if I had a slave woman, not me, I don't want to say. If in a pre-modern time a man had a slave woman, and he had no desire to have sexual intercourse with her, and she's not married, but then desires, she's still going to do the istibra, even though she's spent all this time without having, without the sexual relationship, which further emphasizes that it's an act of worship. So when we say it's an act of worship, what we're also saying is that outwardly there might not be a rational reason why you're going to do it, but we do it because it's an act of worship. Okay, and then the last thing he says is this idea of al-walad. So the al-walad comes at the very end of the book. The last section or chapter of this book is manumission, Kitab al-Itq. And one of the reasons he does that is that he, ends on a note of positivity. And we ask that Allah Ta'ala also free us, al-itq min al-nar, inshallah, all of us together, ameen. And that's one of the reasons why it's mentioned in the end of the book. So the walad, let me just read to you like a couple of lines of that section. This is like the very last page. If a slave owner impregnates his slave, woman that is, and she gives birth to something resembling a human being, she becomes walad, which literally means the mother of a boy or a child. A mother of a child, because it's a boy or girl. And he may not sell her, use her as collateral, or give her as a gift. He may put her to work or hire her, and he can continue to have sexual relations with her. When he dies, she is set free from the top of the estate, before anything, before the payment of debts and distribution of bequests. When somebody dies, the first things you have to do is you have to prepare the deceased. So you take from the deceased money for the kafan and the janazah and all and burial, and then any debts that he has, and then we'll see if he left a bequest, and then you distribute the inheritance. But in this case, she's freed before all of that has even taken place. And then her child from another man, after giving birth to her master's child, follows this ruling, meaning the child is set free as well. So, maybe that didn't do it justice, but the idea is I just wanted to read, because sometimes he mentions something that will happen later in the book. So basically, the transaction that's happening here, or the scenario rather that's happening here, is the slave owner acquires a woman, he has intercourse with her after doing the proper istibra and things like that. He doesn't marry her, but he has intercourse with her, and then she becomes pregnant. She gives birth. The act of giving birth to that child means that she is on the pathway to be free, when the owner dies. So this is what he's talking about, the walad. If a master of a slave, Sayyid, master, yani it's more like an owner, I think is a better translation. But anyway, it also he does say Sayyid. If the master of a slave who has born his child dies, she does the foregoing, meaning she does the istibra herself to ensure that she is not pregnant on her own. It is based on the times of a slave. So even though she is free, she is going to follow the times that we just mentioned. If she menstruates, she's going to wait a menstrual cycle. If she doesn't menstruate, either too young or too old, well, too young wouldn't count in this case. If she's too old or hayrana, confused about the cycle, she'll wait a lunar month. And obviously, if she's pregnant, she will give. If she became pregnant again, then she'll give birth again. And then she's on her way. She's free, and her child is free, and she can move on with her life. ولو استبرأ سيد one interesting thing he says at the end. ولو استبرأ السيد أمته الموطوءة. So if a master or owner does istibra, this waiting period, for a slave woman, and then he frees her, then she does not have to do the istibra again, and she is able to marry right away. So this is the end of the discussion. Just one last thing to say is that as detestable as we find slavery, and it is detestable and all of that, it is important that you can see through some of these rules that this is one of the ways that Islam spread. Okay, so I mean, it's just a historical fact. So the fact that a man can marry up to 4 women, and the fact that a man can marry from Ahl al-Kitab, and the fact that there is a process of slaves coming in and then the children and then becoming free, this is one of the ways that Islam spread slowly, but spread and firmly at the same time throughout history. So for nearly a millennia, this was the case. And the concept of slavery is important for us to understand because the mechanics of the law show us some of the legal thinking behind it. So just because we study something that is no longer applicable does not mean that it's not useful. That's very important. And our way here at the university, the Azhar way, etc., is to do everything to its full extent. Okay, we'll put a pin in it here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, alhamdulillah, I mean, we finished this class. It was a little bit of a difficult one. And again, please refer to my disclaimers all the time when we discuss things related to slavery. So here we are talking about the istibra, which is the waiting period of a slave woman who's been acquired either through slavery or through warfare before a man or the new owner or master desires sexual intercourse. So it follows the waiting period, the iddah of a free woman, because it's the same kind of concept. We do it, although we do it out of worship, so the real illah, the real ratio legis behind it is that it's a form of worship. One of the wisdoms behind it is that it clears the womb from one licit relationship to another licit relationship, and we don't have any therefore confusion about lineage and potential ownership and potential inheritance, so on and so forth. So before a man who buys a slave wants to have any type of intimate relations with the slave, even looking at her intimately, touching her, kissing her, all of the foreplay, and of course most importantly sexual intercourse, he has to do this waiting period. If the woman has a menstrual cycle, we're going to wait 1 menstrual cycle. If the woman doesn't have a menstrual cycle, we wait 1 lunar month. If the woman is pregnant, then she has to give birth to the child. And the last thing we looked at is the walad. So if a man impregnates his slave and she has birth, then she is on the way to freedom. She's an walad. So if the slave owner dies, then she does the istibra for herself. And then she and her child are free. Now, in that, we looked at some of the details and some of the scenarios, like if a man purchased his wife, who was a slave and then freed her, it's a sunnah to do the istibra, but he doesn't have to because he has not reneged or relinquished his sexual rights towards his wife. And this is an example that emphasizes that this is a sunnah, that this is an act of worship. And I gave you the example of praying the 2 rakahs when you enter the mosque, that it's an act of worship. And then sometimes it's a sunnah, or sometimes you don't have to do it. So because it's an act of worship, we're going to always look at it. And then the last thing I'll say in conclusion is, just to repeat again, it's very important that we talk about all the aspects of our law, even if they are no longer applicable, because understanding the underlying principles and legal thinking is very, very important. And maybe we'll find some applications in other scenario. We can take a legal concept from here and apply it somewhere else completely, which is what the fuqaha before us did. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.